In this chapter, we'll be looking at the social institution of marriage and family. Our goal will be to understand it from a sociological perspective and particularly as a social institution. We'll consider the different perspectives, how a functionalist, a symbolic interactionist, and a conflict theorist would view marriage and families. There are many different aspects of the family that sociologists are interested in. Things like love and courtship, child rearing, and how families are organized. There are trends too, changes in how we do families, and we'll look at that. We'll also look at the research on divorce and remarriage and how we might think families could look like in the future. Let's start our chapter thinking about how our social world defines families and marriage, and taking a look at different cultures and their customs and how that shapes their ideas about marriage and family, and how social norms are different from one culture to another. So, what exactly is a family? The sociologists would define that as two or more people who consider themselves to be related by blood, marriage, or adoption. There are many different forms of families depending on the culture. We tend to think about it in terms of what we're used to, and in the United States, we think in terms of the traditional nuclear family that is wife, husband, and children together under one roof. Families can be extended families, though, and that includes people like grandparents, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, and their children. Sociologists also speak in terms of a family of orientation, meaning the family you grew up in, or a family of procreation, which refers to a couple that has their first child. Societies do families in different ways, which we'll consider in just a moment. Marriage takes many different forms, and as we've seen in both Europe and the U.S., no longer does marriage have to be between a man and a woman. In general, marriage will regulate proper sexual relationships. This does not mean that all societies expect monogamy, and in fact that's far from the truth. You can recall the text author discussing his experience in a remote village in Mexico, where the married men expected that he would, like they, partake of the women in a brothel. It was expected behavior and, in part, how manhood was proven. In general, most cultures use marriage as a way of selecting one's mate and who will raise one's children with. It permits descent to be traced. In other words, how one can trace one's lineage and also know who one is related to. This system of tracing relatives can be matrilineal or patrilineal, and descent is often linked to inheritance. In a matrilineal society, the women inherit property, and in a patrilineal society, the men inherit it. When both women and men inherit property, that's called a bilineal system. When sociologists speak of patriarchies, they're referring to societies where men dominate women, which is the case in all modern societies. Now, there is evidence that in ancient times there were matriarchal societies, but there are none that are in existence today. Think about the U.S. custom of brides taking their husband's name. What significance do you think that has in reinforcing social expectations of men being in power? One way of starting to think about the different types of families is to contrast the modern post-industrial family that we're familiar with and contrast that to the traditional family from an agrarian or a hunter-gatherer society. The modern post-industrial family tends to be a nuclear family with parents and children much more independent of extended family members. Contrast that to the extended family of traditional societies, which is a much larger group of people that are depending on each other in many different ways. As your text author explains, there are 6 main functions of the family that these traditional families must meet. These are first, economic production; second, socialization of children; third, care of the sick and the aged; fourth, recreation; fifth, sexual control; and sixth, reproduction. On the other hand, a modern family will have the ability to meet some of these needs through means outside the family structure. In traditional families, the power generally resides in the men in the family, and traditional families tend to be much less egalitarian than modern families. Most modern families also conform to the idea that there's only one spouse, though some traditional societies practice polygamy, meaning more than one spouse. Another area of contrast between traditional and modern families is who selects the spouse. In traditional societies, it's not uncommon for the father to select the spouse, while in modern families, the individuals who are getting married have selected each other. Often, in traditional families, the couple may reside with the groom's family, known as patrilocal residence, or possibly and less commonly to reside with the bride's family, known as matrilocal residence. Traditional families tend to have patrilineal kinship, meaning that the ancestry is traced through the male lines of one's ancestors, though in some societies there is matrilineal kinship. In modern societies, descent is traced through both mother and father. Traditional societies most commonly award inheritance through patrilineal rules, which are often very rigid, though a few societies have matrilineal inheritance. Modern societies have bilineal inheritance.